I'm a pretty big fan of video game controllers. I've got a whole selection of controllers that most people don't even remember came out. But one of the biggest things I love about controllers is that they offer a completely different way to interact with the games that you love. And there's one company that did something pretty crazy in the 90s that most of us don't even remember anymore. Come over here. When Sony released the PlayStation, they had to figure out some kind of crazy way to make their console stand out. Now, of course, it was using CDs, which at the time was still kind of unproven as a good format for gaming. But they were going to do something else, something crazy that most people nowadays don't even remember. They released one of the biggest controllers ever for a console, the PlayStation Analog Joystick. Let's take a look at this thing.
The PlayStation Analog Joystick is Sony's first analog controller for the PlayStation, predating Sony's dual analog controller by a year and also arriving on the market before Nintendo had released the Nintendo 64, which featured a digital thumbstick. While this is not the first analog joystick to be released on a console, it marks one of the first attempts at bringing dual joystick gameplay to the home, making experiences like Sega's arcade smash hit Cyber Troopers Virtual On, a game that uses the same controller layout, a conceivable reality in the living room. Only Sega was still producing consoles during this time period, so that never happened. What did happen though was that Sony released around 40 games that made use of the unique features of the analog joystick. The controller's main feature are the two analog joysticks. Each joystick has a selection of buttons, each one corresponding to the full button layout of the original PlayStation gamepad. The right joystick has a hat switch, which operates the same way as the directional pad does on a regular controller. Games that were produced to utilize this controller use the hat switch independently of the joysticks themselves, usually as a selection tool and a simple way to move around menus in-game. Another feature is that all of the buttons on the joysticks themselves are also featured in the center between the two joysticks. The buttons are presented in a style very reminiscent of an arcade controller layout.
The PlayStation Analog Joystick is no doubt one of the most complex controllers that Sony had ever released for the PlayStation. But that doesn't mean that Sony didn't make good use of it. There were an entire list of games that Sony had released that made perfect use of the controller. But today, we're not going to be looking at that list. We're going to be looking at 3 titles specifically that also use the controller, and they happen to be titles that I kinda like. Descent, a port of the PC original, Mech Warrior 2, another PC port, and an original title that was released on consoles only. Vigilante 8, one of my all-time favorite car combat games. Let's take a look.
Descent.
Descent is one heck of a game. The original came out on PC at a time when 3D gaming was still in its infancy. The game is pretty much a first-person shooter with a twist. You have free 360-degree movement. The gameplay revolved around you rescuing people, fighting off enemies, and destroying a reactor, and escaping the exploding level as fast as you can. It's a classic game, and still holds up really well. In fact, this game here is one of the first 3D games I had ever played. The PlayStation version has a few additional elements that surpass its original PC version, including a remixed soundtrack, some additional levels, pre-rendered cinematics, and even colored lighting effects. But what makes this version best, in my opinion, is the use of this controller. It adds a whole layer of interaction to the game that makes it far more fun to play with than just a regular PlayStation gamepad or even a keyboard.
When they started making first-person shooters on computers, one of the things that they really didn't include was a strafe option. Very few games from the early 90s included the ability to just move directly left or to move directly right. This is something that has become standard in many first-person shooters nowadays. But back then, that wasn't a thing. So Descent, a game that really should utilize it, turns you left and turns you right with this controller setup.
Oh no! Why can't I strafe? There's missiles coming right for me! Oh no! Ah!
And you kinda need to strafe in that game.
Descent makes perfect use of this controller. Everything interacts so well, and in fact, I would go so far as to say that if you're gonna play this game for the first time, you should probably seek this version of the game out with this controller. You will not regret it.
Mech Warrior 2, 31st Century Combat.
Ah, Mech Warrior 2. This was one heck of a game on the PC. And although the developers tried their best to make that experience on the PlayStation, the game just isn't as good as the original. That being said, it's still a pretty cool experience, and that experience is heightened if you play it with this controller. Mech Warrior 2 is a mech combat game, for those of you who couldn't tell, and the whole reason I wanted to try this game was to draw a comparison between this title and Steel Battalion for the Xbox. Steel Battalion for the Xbox, for those of you that don't know, is a really complex game that has a gigantic controller very much like this one. The PlayStation controller is far more simplified, and because of that, Mech Warrior 2 is an easier game to play, but it's still a little bit difficult in parts. While Steel Battalion has pedals, this game doesn't, but that doesn't mean that the controls are easy to use.
The most complex thing is actually trying to move your mech around while aiming with this joystick. You get into this weird, kind of unbelievably difficult mess, and sometimes it doesn't work out. You can have a lot of fun playing this game, but I wouldn't recommend spending too much time playing it because you'll probably lose your damn mind.
Another point to make is very much like the last game, this is another title that was made at a time when strafing really wasn't a thing that existed.
What? I can't strafe! Why can't I strafe? There's missiles coming right for me! Ah!
While this game may not be as good as the original, it still features some really cool mech gameplay that you can play right at home on the PlayStation.
Vigilante 8.
Gamers everywhere always say that Twisted Metal is the definitive car combat gameplay series, but for me, it's Vigilante 8. Vigilante 8 is based off of a PC game called Interstate 76, and while Interstate 76 is based off the Mech Warrior 2 engine and is kind of more complex in a way, Vigilante 8 is a streamlined version of Interstate 76 with a few arcade elements that are very similar to Twisted Metal. This game here is one of my all-time favorites on the PlayStation, and its sequel on the Dreamcast is even better of an experience. But the first one is what got me into the series proper. This game has an amazing soundtrack, fantastic visuals, great levels, great cars, and a lot of really interesting weapons. What you have here is a great single-player experience, plus an amazing multiplayer experience that's just so much fun to play with friends. Unlike Mech Warrior 2 and Descent, I found that this game was far easier to play just using the left joystick. The left joystick controlled your movement, while the right joystick controlled your camera angle. That really kind of messed with me when I was playing, so I just chose to leave it alone. You can fully control the game using the method that you see here. It seems kind of weird, but the gameplay just feels a little bit more in tune that way. However, I gotta say, using a joystick to drive a car, well, it doesn't really work.
The game controls pretty well with this, but to be quite honest, I prefer using an original PlayStation controller, because at least with that, you can throw it in anger. This one, you'd probably break a TV or something.
Whoa, man! This joystick is just jive turkey! I can't use it at all to drive my car! Where's my steering wheel? Oh no! Oh!
I feel like this game just works so much better with a regular PlayStation controller. This is still a really neat experience and one you should try out, but for me, it's the original controller all the way. One of the smartest features that Sony included with the PlayStation Analog Joystick is the ability to switch between analog and digital mode. Now, all the games you've seen up until this point run with the analog mode. That means that this controller is specifically set up in a way that will utilize all of the controller's unique functions. However, with digital mode, it basically just turns both the left and right joystick into D-pads and uses all the buttons the same way a normal PlayStation controller would work. This was a really smart move because it meant that every single PlayStation game can theoretically be played with this controller. Whether that's good or not, well, we're about to find out. I am not the best player of Tekken 3, but this game actually works utilizing just one joystick and the arcade buttons in the center. You would actually think that this would be kind of impossible to play or just really difficult, but it works out really well. And because all of the buttons in the center are actually on the joysticks themselves, you can play this game with just the joysticks. It's kind of a strange experience, but it does work. So if you consider yourself a pro of Tekken 3 and you want to try playing it a different way, you might want to give this a shot. You may enjoy it a little bit more or a heck of a lot less than playing it on a regular controller. As a little bit of a bonus, I also wanted to try out Jet Moto 2. Very much like Tekken 3, everything works, but it's a little hard to control at points. playing Jet Moto 2 with this controller doesn't really better your experience. Personally, I'd rather the PlayStation gamepad. Once again, it's a fun little addition, so if you happen to have the game, give it a shot. You might like it more than I did.
Sony did a fantastic job while designing this controller. Many of the concepts and ideas that went into this design are in newer controllers that they've created, because everything on here was such a smart idea. One of the best things ever was having that digital mode so that you could use this with the entire PlayStation library of games. That's a lot of games, guys. And even if the controller wasn't specifically designed for that game, the ability to use this controller only increases the value of this. So, if you're ever in the wild and you find one of these things just sitting on a store shelf somewhere and the price is pretty good, pick it up. It's a great play, it's a fun thing to own, and you know what? You're not gonna regret it.